Hi guys, welcome back to The Communists Take Power in China. Today's a really interesting lesson. My portion is pretty short. I'd like you to watch the video at the end, and I put it purposely at the end because it's kind of reiterate what I'm telling you. But it's got some great things in it, and I didn't want to cut it apart. I wanted you to see it in its entirety. And so be sure to listen and pay close attention because there are going to be questions at the end for you over the video. But the video, like I said, is also similar to my notes. So, how was Germany partitioned after World War II? And how did that lead to the Berlin airlift? Well, if you said that there was a wall put up in East and West Berlin, you're correct. And it led to the Berlin airlift because with East and West Germany, one being controlled by the Allies and one being controlled by the Soviet Union, the Berlin airlift had to take place because of the blockade that the Soviets put in place and wouldn't allow the Allied forces to get materials into their portion of Berlin. And so eventually there ended up being a Berlin Wall going up, and you know the rest is history. So let's move on to China because it's going to be some good stuff. All right. So a bitter civil war was raging between the nationalists and the communists when the Japanese invaded China in 1937. Now, if you'll remember, the Japanese, they were trying to take control of all of Asia during World War II. So they were moving through. So during World War II, both groups temporarily united to fight the Japanese. So the Civil War kind of came to a screeching halt, and they banded together so that they could beat the Japanese. So World War II in China, under their leader Mao Zedong, the communists had a stronghold in northwestern China. From there, they mobilized peasants for guerrilla war against the Japanese in the northeast. Thanks to their efforts, though, to promote literacy and improve food production, the communists won the peasants' loyalty. So by 1945, they controlled much of northern China. Meanwhile, the nationalist forces under Jiang Jieshi dominated southwestern China. So we've got northeast China, northwest China, southeast China, southwest China. So you can see it's kind of divided into half. Protected from the Japanese by rugged mountain ranges, Jiang gathered an army of 2.5 million men. Now, from 1942 to 1945, the United States sent the nationalists at least $1.5 billion in aid to fight the Japanese. Instead of benefiting the army, however, these supplies and money often ended up in the hands of a few corrupt officers. Jiang's army actually fought few battles against the Japanese. And after Japan surrendered, the nationalists and communists started fighting again. So once the Civil War resumes, it lasted from 1946 to 1949. And at first, the nationalists, they had the advantage. Their army outnumbered the communist army by as much as 3-1. And the United States continued to support the nationalists by providing nearly $2 billion in aid. So the nationalist forces, however, didn't win the popular support of the Chinese people. And so with China's economy collapsing, thousands of nationalist soldiers deserted and um, went to be with the communists. So in spring, I want to see if I can't remember. Nope. Okay, I'm not ready to go there yet. In spring of 1949, China's major cities fell to the communists. Mao's troops were also enthusiastic about his promise to return land to the peasants. So the remnants of Jiang's shattered army fled south. And in October 1949, Mao gained control of the country and he proclaimed it the People's Republic of China. Now, Jiang and other nationalist leaders retreated to the island of Taiwan, which was the Westerners called Formosa. So Mao's victory fueled the U.S. anti-communist feelings. Those feelings only grew after the Chinese and the Soviets signed a treaty of friendship, if you will, in 1950. So many people in the United States viewed the takeover of China as another step in a communist campaign to conquer the world. So, um, China had split into two nations. One was the island of Taiwan, or nationalist China, with an area of about 1,300 square miles. The mainland, or the People's Republic of China, had an area of more than 3.5 million square miles. The existence of two Chinas and the conflicting international loyalties that they inspired only intensified the Cold War. So the superpowers weren't going to sit by and watch. They reacted. And after Jiang fled to Taiwan, the US helped him set up a nationalist government on that small island, and it was called the Republic of China. The Soviets gave financial, military, and technical aid to communist China. So, in addition, the Chinese and the Soviets pledged to come to each other's defense if either was attacked. The United States tried to halt Soviet expansion in Asia. For example, when the Soviet forces occupied the northern half of Korea after World War II and set up a communist government, the United States supported a separate state in the South. And to this day, there is still a North Korea and a South Korea. China only expanded under communist rule. So in the early years of Mao's reign, Chinese troops expanded into Tibet and India and Inner Mongolia. Northern or Outer Mongolia, which bordered the Soviet Union, remained in the Soviet sphere. It was one of their territories. In a brutal assault in 1950 and 1951, China took control of Tibet. Now, the Chinese promised autonomy to the Tibetans, who followed their religious leader, and you're going to have heard of this person, the Dalai Lama. When China's control over Tibet tightened in the late 1950s, the Dalai Lama fled to India. Now, India welcomed many Tibetan refugees after a failed revolt in Tibet in 1959. So, as a result, resentment between India and China only grew. And in 1962, they clashed briefly over the two countries' unclear border. The fighting stopped, but the resentment did continue. So the Great Leap Forward was to expand the success of the first 5-year plan. Mao proclaimed it early in 1958. Now, this plan called for large collective farms or communes. And by the end of 1958, about 26,000 communes had been created. The average commune sprawled over 15,000 acres and supported over 25,000 people. In the strictly controlled life of the communes, the peasants worked the land together. They ate in communal dining rooms, they slept in communal dormitories, and they raised children in communal nurseries. They owned nothing. The peasants had no incentive to work hard, only when the state profited from their labor. So you're seeing that's a problem. The Great Leap Forward was actually a giant step backward. Poor planning and inefficient home industries hampered the growth. The program ended in 1961 after crop failures caused a famine that killed about 20 million people. So their new policies and Mao's response, China was facing external problems as well as internal ones in the late 1950s. So the spirit of cooperation that had bound the Soviet Union and China was beginning to fade. And so each sought to lead the worldwide communist movement. So here we've got these two giant, and they're both communists, and they both want to be the ones to take over the world. So now they're no longer friendly with each other, but now they're in competition. They also, interestingly enough, shared the largest border in the world, and they faced a lot of territorial disputes on where the actual border was. So even after the failure of the Great Leap Forward and the split with the Soviet Union, Mao reduced his role in government. Other leaders moved away from Mao's strict socialist ideas. For example, farm families could live in their own homes and could sell crops they grew on small private plots. Factory workers could compete for wage increases and promotions. Now, Mao thought China's new economic policies weakened the communist goal of social equality. He was determined to revive the revolution, and so in 1966, he urged China's young people to learn revolution by, quote, making revolution. Millions of high school and college students responded. They left their classrooms and formed militia units called Red Guards. All right. Oh, I was a slide behind. All right. So, come on. Oh, no, let me go back. So, chaos. Okay, the Red Guards. Let me tell you a little bit about them. The Red Guards led a major uprising known as the Cultural Revolution, and its goal was to establish a society of peasants and workers in which all were equal. Now, the new hero was the peasant who worked with his hands. In the life of the mind, the intellectual and artistic activity was considered useless and dangerous. So, in other words, the communists, they didn't want people to think for themselves. They didn't want them to be creative. They wanted them to be little robots and just to do what they were being told. To stamp out this threat, the Red Guards shut down colleges and schools because, again, they didn't want their people to be educated. They targeted anyone who resisted the regime, and intellectuals had to, quote, purify themselves by doing hard labor in remote villages. Thousands were executed or imprisoned. So this chaos threatened farm production and closed down factories. civil war seemed possible, and by 1968, even Mao admitted that the Cultural Revolution had to stop. The army was ordered to put down the Red Guards. Zhang Yunli, the Chinese Communist Party founder and premier since 1949, began to restore order. While China was struggling to become stable, the Cold War continued to rage around them. So 2 full-scale wars were fought during this, Korea and Vietnam. And we're going to talk about those tomorrow. But before we go there, we're going to watch a video on Cold War China.
1949, revolution in China. The People's Liberation Army were welcomed as heroes in Beijing. Led by Mao Zedong, the communists had triumphed in a civil war against the nationalists. Soviet support had been unreliable. The Chinese felt they'd managed it alone.
The Communist Party seemed wonderful. It was democratic, it was egalitarian, it promised food for everyone. And so, of course, the ideal of communism gradually entered my spirit.
The Americans were devastated to lose China, their best friend in Asia. On October 1st, Mao Zedong told the crowd in Tiananmen Square that a new China was born. The country was in chaos, exhausted after years of war. Mao needed external help. One of Mao's first acts was to visit Moscow to get military protection and economic aid. He was met at the station by Foreign Minister Molotov and most of the Politburo. In February 1950, the Chinese and the Soviets signed a mutual defense treaty. The treaty also guaranteed aid for China.
At that time, there was the attitude everywhere that Moscow and the Chinese communists were tightly linked, hand in hand. This was perceived by many to be part of a worldwide conspiracy, and hence was somewhat frightening.
Mao gratefully accepted the help of Soviet experts in rebuilding Chinese industry. China's rulers embarked on radical land reforms. Land was taken from private owners and handed to the peasants. The former landowners were denounced and humiliated. A million lost their lives. In June 1950, North Korea, with Soviet and Chinese backing, attacked South Korea.
The sudden attack by the North Koreans dealt the slender forces below the 38th parallel a mortal blow. The prompt arrival on the scene of U.S. soldiers gave Marshal Stalin and his cold-eyed strategists a rude shock.
Forces under United Nations command pushed the invaders back to the Chinese border. China feared an attack on its own territory.
最主要的敌人啊，是
The main enemy was America.
就是当时
At that time, all the propaganda was directed against America.
就是全世
The
界
proletariat of the whole world must unite to get rid of the
要把
capitalists.
资本家全部消灭，
America was a capitalist country, and so it had to be got rid of.
就全部消灭。
Under the banner, Help Korea, Down with US Imperialism, more than 1 million Chinese troops would cross the border into Korea. The Korean War lasted for 3 years and cost more than 500,000 Chinese lives. In China, cinema audiences watched films of bumper harvests and new industrial records.
一个新纪录接连着一个新纪录，一个英雄爱过一个英雄。中国的工人阶级以自己无穷的智慧和力量，胜利地结束了工业恢复阶段，迎接着即将开始的大规模的经济建设。
Steel production was a yardstick of national virility. The success of the first 3-year plan was celebrated. But although exhilarating, Soviet aid had to be paid for. Stalin's death in 1953 had a deep impact in China. Despite Mao's misgivings, he had respected the Soviet leader's iron authority. After a power struggle in the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the new Soviet leader. He and his Politburo visited China to maintain the alliance. The size and power of the communist bloc made the new American administration increasingly anxious.
We can see that China is the basic cause of all of our troubles in Asia. If China had not gone communist, we would not have had a war in Korea. If China were not communist, there would be no war in Indochina. There would be no war in Malaya. Today, there are approximately 540 million people who can be counted on the side of the free nations. There are 800 million on the communist side. And there are 600 million others who must be counted as non-committed.
America did everything to stop the spread of communism. To prevent China attacking the Chinese nationalist stronghold of Formosa or Taiwan, the United States financed a military build-up on the island.
Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, along with his American advisors, reviews Free Chinese nationalist forces in an Independence Day parade. More than 500,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines have as their ultimate aim and living goal the return to China's mainland.
The nationalist government was determined to defend 2 small islands off the China coast, Quemoy and Matsu. In September 1954, the communists shelled the island of Quemoy. 3 months later, Washington signed a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan.
Almost immediately, the major units of the 7th Fleet are shifted to Formosa to augment the United States and nationalist patrols in the strait and along the mainland. The action upholds the United States pledge to meet the common danger, communism.
The American show of strength failed to stop the Chinese Communist challenge. All-out war came closer. America made nuclear threats. Mao's provocation and America's response concerned Khrushchev, whose nuclear bombs guaranteed China's security. Khrushchev told the Chinese that war with imperialism was no longer inevitable. At the 20th Soviet Party Congress in February 1956, in a secret session that was not filmed, Khrushchev denounced Stalin as a criminal. Mao took it as a threat to his own style of leadership. In October 1956, the Hungarians rose up against Soviet domination. While Khrushchev hesitated, Mao urged a violent crackdown. For the 40th anniversary of the Soviet Revolution, Mao went to Moscow. He used the occasion to put himself forward as the new leader of world revolution. But Soviet aid was undermining Mao's aim for total independence. The crunch came in 1958.
Khrushchev wanted to set up a long-wave radio station along the Chinese coast to guide Soviet submarines. He suggested setting up a joint naval fleet. This was a clear sign that the Soviets wanted to control China.
Mao still needed Soviet know-how. He wanted to create China's own nuclear industry.
The Chinese comrades then expressed a new wish. They said they would very much like to receive more aid from us in order to build plants and facilities for the production of the atomic bomb. Such an agreement was signed.
Mao said that the atomic bomb was a paper tiger. But he also knew that whether a country had the atomic bomb or not had a huge bearing on its position in the world and on its international influence.
In 1958, Khrushchev visited China to renew Soviet support. But Mao's nuclear demands had already strained relations with the big brother.
Mao Zedong said, "You are communists, and we are communists. Communists usually share. Will you give us the atomic bomb or not?" Khrushchev. "And what do you want the atomic bomb for? We have the atomic bomb, and we will stand up for China just the same as we would for the Soviet Union." "Yes," Mao said, "it's true. But we are not just some tin pot village. China is a great country, and we want to have it." Khrushchev, "You don't need it," and so on. Mao then says, "So you don't want to give it to us then?"
The struggle for preeminence in the communist world was now out in the open.
Here were two despots, each used to having his own way. They couldn't cooperate. In the communist camp, the question was always, who was number one? Who was the Tsar?
On one occasion, during the 1959 trip, Khrushchev spoke disrespectfully about Mao Zedong. He said that Mao was an old boot that ought to be thrown out.
Soviet advisors would soon be withdrawn from China. Rivalry between the communist powers was ideological as well as personal.
Ideological squabbles could get quite comical. The Soviet side would say, "We are the Marxists." And then the Chinese would say, "No, we are the Marxists." The Soviets would say, "We are red." And the Chinese would say, "We are even redder." It could appear funny, but the damage was really serious.
In 1958, Mao had thought up a new policy, the Great Leap Forward, the grandiose plan to transform China into a rich world power. Land was taken over by the state. The family unit was to disappear. People were organized into huge communes. A utopian world of plenty would come from sheer force of will. Mao's method was to be a more extreme version of Stalin's brutal collectivization of the 1930s.
The Great Leap Forward was a kind of recklessness. Mao wanted to change the face of China in the shortest time possible. The slogan was, struggle hard for 3 years. Change the face of China. Catch up with Britain. Catch up with America. It was completely unrealistic.
Because steel remained a key symbol of national vitality, the entire country reverted to pre-industrial backyard furnaces. People worked day and night to produce massive amounts of useless metal. Crops were left to rot. Scientific knowledge and all common sense were ignored. No one dared to tell the truth for fear of arrest or worse.
The lies of the Great Leap Forward were absolutely unbelievable. Anybody who did not speak in falsehoods was demoted or expelled from their jobs. From the time of the Great Leap Forward, all Chinese people learned to tell lies.
The peasants' food was taken from them by force to make up bogus quotas. It was one of the worst man-made disasters in history.
We had to eat the husks of coarse grain, not even the grain itself. We ate leaves of trees. We all went down with hepatitis. Many peasants died of starvation. No one really knew how many.
Because of Mao's policy, over 30 million people starved to death. Hiding the catastrophe, Mao still posed as the leader of world communism. Blocked by Washington from the United Nations, China became the champion of anti-American causes. Third world leaders and Western intellectuals flocked to Beijing. In Moscow, Khrushchev was pursuing peaceful coexistence with the West.
The Kremlin is the setting of an historic event, the signing of an atom test ban. The big three representatives, Dean Rusk, Andrei Gromyko, and Lord Hume, signed for the U.S., Russia, and Britain. Most other nations of the world, with the notable exception of France, Communist China, and Cuba, are to sign later. Communist China has denounced the Soviets for making the treaty, widening further the breach between the two communist powers.
Mao reacted to the nuclear test ban treaty with defiance.
The Chinese Communist nuclear detonation is a reflection of policies which do not serve the cause of peace.
In 1965, U.S. Marines were sent to South Vietnam. President Johnson was determined to prevent communist North Vietnam and its allies in the South gaining power. In China, the masses were mobilized to support neighboring North Vietnam. A war between China and the United States was once again a possibility. Haunted by the failure of the Great Leap Forward, Mao was fighting to maintain his domination of China. In 1966, he launched the Great Cultural Revolution.
He failed to bring about an economic miracle, so in 1966 he wanted a political miracle. He not only wanted to get rid of his enemies, he wanted to do something that Stalin had been unable to do: destroy government bureaucracy.
The Mao personality cult did not come to full blossoming until the Cultural Revolution, when he became the so-called Four Greats: the great leader, great helmsman, great supreme commander, great teacher. He has replaced Stalin.
Millions of young people were recruited to be Mao's Red Guards. Their idealism was exploited to create mayhem and to destroy every vestige of the past.
Chairman Mao says, Marxism consists of thousands of truths, but they all boil down to one phrase: it's right to rebel.
The first action was to change the names of roads. The name of the road outside the Soviet embassy was changed to Anti-Revisionism Road. There were demonstrations outside the Soviet embassy. Most of the demonstrators were Red Guards.
In the morning, they would hang up dummies of Brezhnev, Kosygin, and Podgorny. When it began to get dark, they took them down and started a huge bonfire at the entrance of the embassy and burnt the dummies. The Red Guards and the young people gathered around the fire and danced and yelled anti-Soviet slogans.
Пекинские провокаторы не унимаются. In 1969, tension along the vast Soviet-Chinese border increased.
Границы Союза Советских Социалистических Республик священны и неприкосновенны.
Images of aggressive Chinese at the border fueled Soviet fears of an invasion.
Siberia and the Far East was sparsely populated. So what if the Chinese millions began pouring in? Writers had warned before about the Yellow Peril, that the Chinese would come right through Russia and conquer Europe.
Soviet Premier Kosygin visited Beijing in October 1969 to stop a potential war and restore relations. Mao, fearful of Moscow's belligerence, had already decided he wanted better relations with America. America's new president, Richard Nixon, although a lifelong anti-communist, came to a similar conclusion. To limit Soviet power and end the Vietnam War, he wanted to draw closer to China.
Dr. Henry Kissinger.
With his new national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, Nixon developed a foreign policy which exploited the hostility between the communist giants. Nixon's trip to Beijing changed the balance of the Cold War. His Chinese triumph also stole the headlines from the increasingly grim events in Vietnam.
Premier Zhou Enlai moves forward to greet the first American president to set foot on Chinese soil. East meets West as a handshake bridges 16,000 miles and 22 years of hostility. welcoming speeches, no formal ceremonies. Just a receiving line made up of Communist Party officials and the military band playing the Star-Spangled Banner. Peking newspapers, which had played down the Nixon visit, now give it front-page coverage. Dealers sell out as readers follow day by day the president's activities. Today, the president walks among priceless treasures from China's golden age. Among them, a pair of ear stoppers used by the emperor to keep from hearing criticism.
Give me a pair.
I didn't put my foot down and say, now I've just made history. On the way back from Beijing, I knew we had made history.
All right, so that ends our lesson today on Cold War China. You can see we're kind of heading into next the Vietnam and Korean Wars, and we're going to see, now remember those are going on at the same time as all of this turmoil is also going on, as well as in the Soviet Union. So tune in tomorrow and have a great rest of your day.